being here today to engage in critical study and discussion with one another is just as important as any direct action that we can do. One of the only reasons that the genocide and the ethnic cleansing that's happening in Palestine has been able to go on for 75 years is because people of the world, working people of the world, have been lied to for decades by corporate media and by our governments. And so it's important at this juncture that, especially when every time you unlock your phone or turn on your TV, there's some new heinous lie or allegation meant to paint Hamas as a terrorist organization or Palestinians as somehow less than human or deserving of the incredible violence that they're experiencing. It's important that people of conscience, like all of us in this room, speak up and call out those lies and challenge them and practice telling the truth and continuing to educate ourselves when we maybe don't know the full truth. And so I see this event as one opportunity out of many to practice such truth-telling. And today we're going to hear from some incredible thinkers and writers. And my hope is that everyone here, whether you're Puerto Rican, Palestinian, whatever, I hope that you leave here inspired, filled with lots of revolutionary optimism, and understanding a little bit more about how the struggle for Puerto Rican liberation and the struggle for Palestinian liberation are inextricably linked, and really all anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggles. Ghassan Kanafani, who was a beloved Palestinian militant and thinker and writer, said, "Imperialism has laid its body over the world. Whenever you strike it anywhere, you damage it and you serve the world revolution." And when we understand this, then we understand that to say free Palestine is to say free Puerto Rico as well. It's the same struggle and it's the same fight. And so I'm going to wrap up my opening remarks here. We have lots to talk about when it comes to the historical links of solidarity between Puerto Rico and Palestine. And I want to hand it over to our panelists who are going to do a much better job than I could at outlining all of that for y'all. I believe we're going to start with Geo. Geo Maher is the coordinator. What was that? With Hiram? Okay, sorry about that. We're starting with Hiram. Hiram Rivera is an organizer with almost 20 years of experience. He's former director of the Philadelphia Student Union. His activism work began on campaigns to free Puerto Rican and New African political prisoners. He's a trainer with Soul and currently the director of a national organization, the Community Resource Hub, which provides research and technical assistance to defund and police abolition campaigns across the country. So give it up for Hiram, y'all.
All right, cool. So thank you everybody for coming. Thank you to my PSL for inviting me, being on this panel with these two amazing folks right here. Can you all hear me good? I don't even know. Hello. So real quick, how familiar are folks in the room with the history of Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico's political reality and its relationship to the United States? Good. Cool. All right. So I don't spend too much time on that. Right. The history of colonialism in Puerto Rico, as in Palestine, has been one of violence, displacement, and extraction, dating all the way back to 1493, when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right, landed in the Dominican Republic, and in 1492, and in 1493 ends up in Puerto Rico, starting the process of Puerto Rican colonization, making Puerto Rico the longest running colony in the history of the world, right? Dating back, beginning with the Spanish and then later with the United States. One of our great forefathers, thinkers, Eugenio María de Hostos, said, "There's not a single page in the history of Borinquen, the original name of Puerto Rico, that does not cry out against our lives as colonized people." Puerto Rico has always resisted since day one. Yeah. Since day one has always resisted and continues to resist, even under 126 years of US occupation. And so a part of this resistance has always been this idea of nationhood, right? The importance of nationhood. Nationhood being tied to the land, to the actual land, right, of Puerto Rico. That nationhood and that land meant independence, and independence meant the ability to decide on your own and for your own what that nation is going to be, how that nation is going to live, how that nation is going to survive. And at every point since the invasion of 1898 by the United States, there has been an intentional attempt at crushing that resistance, at crushing that idea of nationhood, at crushing that desire for Puerto Ricans to stay on our land, to stay in our country, fight for it, and build the nation that we want to see in collaboration, in support, in familial unity with the rest of the Caribbean islands that we have been severed from since that invasion of 1898. And so, why Puerto Rico? Why is Puerto Rico the oldest colony on the earth? Puerto Rico is a strategic point for the United States because of its geographic location. As it was with the Spanish, being a military outpost for both empires from which they can strike at Central America, South America, and the rest of the Caribbean. Puerto Rico has played this role for the empire since its beginning and continues to play that role now as it extends to the wars outside into Europe, into Africa, into the Middle East. And so that violence that has come at the hands of the United States towards up to the United States has taken a number of ways. One has been economic violence, devaluing the peso, right, when they came in, which at one point was 1-for-1 with the US dollar. After the US invasion, drops down to 60 cents, which ultimately crippled the coffee farmers of that time, the industry at that time, which was then completely devastated in 1926 with the hurricane of San Felipe, which left hundreds of thousands of folks homeless and dead. I bring this up because that ties to Hurricane Maria just a few years ago, which had the same devastating impact on the island and led to an exodus of folks at that time period. At that time of the hurricane, the Rockefeller Foundation, and I bring this up because of the roles of philanthropy and nonprofits in the struggle today, the Rockefeller Foundation sent doctors to Puerto Rico to help those folks. One of those doctors was Cornelius Rhodes, of who the Rhodes Scholarship is named after, who upon getting to Puerto Rico decided that Puerto Ricans were subhuman. They were not worthy of life. They were below even Italians, in his word, right? And that Puerto Rico would be a better off place if all the Puerto Ricans were killed off and eradicated, and began a process of starting cancer experiments and purposely injecting Puerto Ricans with cancer to kill us off. A lot of that same language shows up in other colonial experiences and definitely shows up in Palestine. It leads all the way into the 1930s, the sterilization process, right, of the Puerto Rican women, where 1/3 of all Puerto Rican women, childbearing Puerto Rican women, were sterilized so that they would not be able to have any babies and to stay inside of the factories. This is during the World War, when after 1917, the United States imposes US citizenship on Puerto Ricans because we never asked to be US citizens. It was imposed on us to make us a part of the draft, to send us off to the wars in Europe, to die as cannon fodder, and to keep our women in factories, right, with the now industrialized economy that took over and replaced the agricultural one that existed before. Keep them in the factories and make sure there are no Puerto Ricans left on this island so they can completely take it over. And so when Cornelius Rhodes's experiments get exposed out into the forefront, this gave rise to a particular type of resistance, right, that appeared in Puerto Rico, which was nationalism. It was a revolutionary nationalism. It was a nationalism that existed that revolved around our identity as Puerto Rican people. Puerto Ricans are created out of revolution. Prior to Columbus coming, the island was inhabited by natives, right? There was an influx of European settlers that came. There was the influx of the enslaved Africans, and through that process created Puerto Ricans, right? And so when we think about that, and we think about Cornelius Rhodes, the nationalist movement rises and says that we are a distinct people. We are distinct people with a distinct culture, a distinct identity that has a right to this land, has a right to stay here, has a right to raise our families here, our children here, and to live as Puerto Ricans, not as what you outside invaders say we have to live. And starts a process of resistance that went from using the safe means, right, of strikes, of asking the US government for permission, please, to ultimately coming to the realization that the only way independence was going to come about was through violence. The invaders came in with violence, and they will only leave through violence. And that movement was led by a Harvard graduate, Don Pedro Albizu Campos, right, who said, when tyranny is law, revolution is order. It is the supreme hour. It is the hour of discipline. It is the hour of intense preparation. It is the hour of silence, the silence that precedes great storms. The silence that precedes great storms, and an understanding there's a particular type of organizing that must happen, a disciplined organizing, organized, right? Structure and organizing of the people to wage that fight and bring about that great storm against the empire, against the invaders who invaded our country. The connections with Puerto Rico and Palestine and the solidarity that we see today here in the United States, in Puerto Rico, which have been weekly and weekly and weekly. The largest Arab population in Puerto Rico is the Palestinian one. Weekly marches and rallies inside of Puerto Rico, one that led to the taking down of the US flag on top of the Capitol building in San Juan and replacing it with the Palestinian flag, comes because of our shared experiences under US imperialism. In Palestine, it comes by way proxy of Israeli regime, but it's still US imperialism. It is brutality, it is dehumanization of our people. It is calling us subhuman. It is the attacks on our babies. It is the attacks on our women. It is the making our flags illegal. The Puerto Rican flag was not legal until 1952. You could be put in prison for having the Puerto Rican flag all the way up until 1952, even though the flag was born and created in New York City in 1865, purposely to look like the Cuban flag out of that solidarity with the Cuban people. The original Puerto Rican Republican flag looked like the flag of the Dominican Republic, again, intentionally in solidarity with the people of the Dominican Republic. The Puerto Rican people have always had a history of strong solidarity, going to Hostos, who I just mentioned in the beginning, who started the education system in Chile, all the way to Juan Geo Rivera, Lola del Tío, who fought for the Cuban Revolution, Antonio Valero Bernabé, who fought with Simón Bolívar to liberate Mexico, to liberate Venezuela. Puerto Ricans have always stood in solidarity with other oppressed people, never expecting anything in return. And so through the process of industrialization, through the process of violent US capitalism and Operation Bootstrap in the 1950s, 400,000 Puerto Ricans were sent off the island to work in the factories of the United States. And if you wonder why there's so many Puerto Ricans here up and down the East Coast and all over the United States, it is because of that. It is because of forced displacement by US capital and US settlers to remove Puerto Ricans out of the island and send them off over here into the cities, in the factories of Detroit, of New York, of Hartford, of Philadelphia, of Newark, New Jersey. Puerto Rico was lifted up as a model system for the rest of the Caribbean, which was just a facade, when the majority of the Puerto Rican people to this day live below the poverty line, live dependent on assistance from the federal government. That created a diaspora and created this phenomenon where the majority of the Puerto Rican nation resides outside of Puerto Rico itself because of that forced displacement. And now we fast forward, I'm sorry to wrap this up, into where we are today, where after NAFTA in the 90s and all the factors, all the tax incentives that were created to send businesses to Puerto Rico at the benefit of US capital, move offshore, it devastated the Puerto Rican economy, sunk that model, right? Sunk the model and drove everyone to poverty, leaving up 400,000 people to leave in the 1950s. A lot of our grandparents, a lot of our parents came during that wave. At that time, there was an extreme violent repression that led to the bombing of our cities. It was the nationalist uprising of 1950, and ultimately the revolt in 1954 with Lolita Lebrón, Rafael Cancelbran, and the rest attacking the United States Congress. The only nation in the world who has ever been able to attack the United States in the heart of their imperial core. This cemented also Puerto Rico as a military outpost because in 1959 in Cuba, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and the rest created a new model. And those two realities were existing at the same time. On one end, colonial reality of Puerto Rico, on the other end, socialist, right? Socialism in Cuba. And so Puerto Rico remains a military outpost to contain Cuba, to contain the socialist project in Venezuela, and to continue to make sure that socialism does not spread throughout the region. And so a lot of these rallies, these protests that are happening in Puerto Rico, that are coming from the Puerto Rican people, comes from a very lived reality and very similar experiences that our people in our nation have experienced for the last 500 years and 126 years in the United States, that is in line with the violence and the repression that the Palestinian people are experiencing at the hands of the United States government by proxy of the Israeli regime. And we'll continue to stand toe-to-toe in line, as we always have, with the Palestinian people until both of our nations are free.
Thank you so much, Hiram. I hope that folks learned a little bit about Puerto Rico during that speech. One thing that I thought was really interesting that you brought up was like the tax incentives, which hopefully we can talk about more, because currently that's one of the biggest threats to Puerto Ricans on the island, being displaced by this new wave of colonizers, most of whom move there and push people out because they get these tax incentives and tax breaks on things like real estate and cryptocurrency specifically. They're known as crypto colonizers. And I just want to highlight that like these connections between PR and Palestine are not just like some sort of abstract thing. They're very real, economic, tangible ties. Brock Pierce, who's one of the most famous crypto colonizers in PR, regularly meets with Benjamin Netanyahu. And there's two other, I think David Malkin and like Jordan Fried are their names. They bankrolled $1 million that they made off the backs of Puerto Ricans through these predatory laws. And they sent that money to charter an Airbus shortly after October 7th to send 150 reservists in LA to Tel Aviv to fight with the idea. And so even today, there's these very real economic and military ties between our two struggles. Okay, I'm gonna invite our next panelist to speak, who I believe is gonna give us some more info on the Palestinian context and the role of resistance, right? So let me just pull up my notes so I can introduce him properly. Nicki Kattoura is a Palestinian writer and editor. His writing has been featured in Mondoweiss, Palestine Studies, Middle East Eye, and GQ Middle East. Nicki, thank you so much.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you to Hiram and Geo. Thank you for inviting me. I wish I could speak as freely as Hiram just did, but I've written down what I want to say, but I'll try not to look down too much. Can you hear me okay? There's something about the weather. So begins the Red Nation's indispensable manifesto, the RÍo. They write, quote, "Last year, bushfires in Australia scorched 46 million acres, an area larger than Hungary and Portugal combined. Flames shot nearly half a mile in the air, killing 34 humans and more than 1 billion animals. In the US, over 8 million acres burned, killing 37 people and displacing countless others. Swarms of locusts darkened the sky in parts of East Africa and West Asia, leaving hardly a scrap of green. A single living swarm in Kenya amassed to a size 3 times larger than New York City. Tens of millions of people across the globe faced increased food insecurity," end quote. To speak of the weather assumes a basic objectivity due to its nature, both literal and figurative. The weather of the day is believed to occur separate from humanity's agency. Since we cannot control it, we cannot prevent it. However, as all of us in the room are aware, the weather is deeply tied to the woes and wills of capitalism, a result of the insatiable thirst for oil, profit, and land, regardless of the environmental devastation it wreaks. I begin with meteorology, not because I'm awkwardly attempting to engage you in small talk, but because the weather can provide us with an analysis on the horrors of colonialism and capitalism more broadly, and can reveal the importance of agency, the obfuscated agency of those who oppress us, and our agency and the natural response to resist them. When Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico in September 2017, many thought of it as a, quote, natural disaster. The devastating winds that peaked at 175 miles an hour and the resulting floods from a torrential downpour tragically killed over 3,000 Puerto Ricans. While the weathers were not controlled by people and hurricanes are a tragic component of the earth itself, to say Maria was natural is a falsity. No, the rains were not a weapon wielded by an army, but they were produced by capitalism-induced climate change, of which the US military is hugely to blame. Hurricanes are natural insofar as they occur, but unnatural in the frequency and intensity that we've been seeing around the world. Framing rains as a, quote, natural disaster removes the state's responsibility that violently colonized the islands, that continues to frack and protect oil industry's massive appetite for profit, regardless of the scientific evidence that concludes that pillaging the land for its resources is killing the planet. Tragically, the number of casualties for Maria is probably much higher than official reports through the phenomenon of slow violence, a violence of delayed destruction that kills not by the relentless rainfall, but by its aftermath. How many were killed from the lack of electricity due to the privatization of the power grid, the spread of diseases, the alarming number of homeless? I could go on. What I'm trying to say is that this violence is produced by a colonial state and its neoliberal policies that continues to privatize basic resources and kills and disrupts those who attempt to nationalize them. The inaction of colonizers to protect brown and black people and respond to crisis also kills. In Gaza, the world wants us to believe that a similar natural disaster is occurring. The Hamas resistance in October 7th is consistently described as dastardly, terrorist attacks, violent, trying to pathologize Arabs as inherently violent. Whereas the material devastation of Gaza in the last 2 months is a, quote, humanitarian crisis, like an act of God, not produced, but simply naturally occurring, despite the repeated promises of genocide from Israeli state officials, calling for a, quote, second Nakba, or promising to flatten Gaza to the ground. Why? To manufacture consent, first of all, and to remove the responsibility of Israel and their agency, an American ally that receives almost $4 billion in military aid annually. The carnage of the last 8 weeks has been incomprehensible. Since October 7th, 20,000 Palestinians have not just died, they have been killed. 40,000 were injured by tripping or falling, but because of Israeli airstrikes that burned them beyond recognition and amputated their limbs. 1.7 million people, which is more than the population of Philadelphia, have been internally displaced not because their homes arbitrarily decided to deconstruct, but because of relentless Israeli carpet bombing and their forced migration from North to South Gaza. The hospitals didn't stop functioning because Palestinian doctors were exhausted, but because the full blockade against Gaza's healthcare system has refused the importation of fuel and electricity, not to mention the many sieges by the Israeli army and the snipers that shot at every doctor that moved. The media might want us to think that the last 62 days found dead, quote, 70 journalists, but more accurately, they were executed, just like Israel assassinated Shireen Abu Akleh the year prior. Gaza's children aren't dying of starvation or dehydration, they are being starved and dehydrated because Israel is blocking all access to food and water, bombing bakeries and desalination plants, forcing them to resort to drinking water from the sea. Now, Israel is manipulating the weather by flooding Gaza's tunnel system with salt water, an act that will lead to devastating repercussions, such as destroying the city's aquifer and making agriculture nothing short of impossible. Nothing about the violence in Gaza is a humanitarian crisis or an act of God or a result of the winds. It is a genocide, a concerted US and Israeli effort to ethnically cleanse the population for their land and their natural gas. But while the occupation of Gaza is not a natural disaster, it is an abhorrent aberration of the human consciousness. The disaster is not natural, but the resistance to it is. In the brilliant Geo Maher's brilliant book, Anticolonial Eruptions, he asks, quote, what if metaphors of natural disasters portend not the permanence of white supremacy, but explosive resistance against it? If racism is a force of nature, then those who resist it do so with the power of an irrepressibly seismic reaction beyond all possible moral condemnation. Such disastrous beings can throw even the permanence of nature into chaos, end quote. For Frederick Douglass, as Geo writes, turn to seismic and more broadly meteorological metaphors, for it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, the earthquake, end quote, and the flood. On October 7th, in response to 17 years of siege, 56 years of occupation, and 75 years of settler colonial violence, as a result of home demolitions, the ethnic cleansing of villages, the assaulting of worshippers at Al-Aqsa Mosque, the settler pogroms, the extrajudicial killing of Palestinians, the checkpoints that fragment Palestinian land and humiliate natives, in response to the assaults on Gaza in 2014, 2012, 2008, 2021, the inaction of the international community, and so much more. Militants, in an operation that they dubbed the Al-Aqsa Flood, attached propellers to their paragliders as they flew, escaping the besieged Gaza Strip that had incarcerated them for almost 2 decades. Not only did they escape the prison by air, they smashed through the wall with a bulldozer, the same wall that they had, that tens of thousands of people had peacefully marched towards during the Great March of Return in 2018, with the same bulldozer that crushed and killed Rachel Corrie when she was protesting the ethnic cleansing of a Palestinian village. Although Israel was, quote, surprised by these attacks, those of us who have supported the call for Palestinian freedom knew that it was only a matter of time. Palestinians have asked, demanded, screamed, begged, and resisted day after day, year after year for their freedom. This resistance was clearly the culmination of 75 years of the brutal apartheid regime. If Israel wasn't going to take their foot off our necks, we'd have to remove it with force. While the media and Zionist discontents want us to believe that the flood was an arbitrary act of violence aimed at, quote, eliminating Jewish people, we know this is not true. It is the culmination of unspeakable violence. Even during the week-long truce last week, Israel shot a 9-year-old boy in the head and left him to die. This is the status quo of the occupation. To put it another way, the unconscionable genocide of the last 62 days is precisely why October 7th happened. It is the ceaseless dehumanization and unaccountable violence that causes resistance in the first place. People have lost families, communities, their entire city. They have lost everything, so what else is there to do but resist? There is nothing more to lose but everything to gain. So what does framing resistance as a natural response mean to us? And what does it require from people of conscience and principled organizers such as yourselves? It means resistance should not be debated or moralized. Our personal feelings around violence should not be the departure point for our solidarity. Deal with those feelings in private and be aware that as long as people are occupied, brutalized, and stripped of their freedoms, there will always be floods and infernos, whether it is the surge of water from Gaza or the inferno that enveloped the Minneapolis precincts in 2020. Our politics should not be guided by an affective analysis, but by a logical one. As Gaza is being flattened, it is crucial that we stand behind Palestinians unequivocally, that our solidarity is not conditional, that we center and amplify Palestinian voices and calls to action, not mine, but those in Gaza, those facing the monstrosity, those heroically resisting, and those who will undoubtedly be victorious and free us all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nikki. Yeah, it just, you know, obviously all of us have been in the streets for weeks chanting resistance is justified when people are occupied. And I think that gets to the heart of what Nikki was saying. As long as there's occupation in Palestine or in any colonized nation, there will always be resistance. And that's not terrorism that's justified. Resistance is dignity, right? Resistance is life. How can you expect people not to fight back? There will always be confrontation when oppressors like the United States and Israel are waging violence and occupation in foreign lands. People don't just go quietly and submit to their oppressors. And so we have to view the events of October 7th in that lens, the events of the past 75 years in that lens, and aspire towards resistance that will help us achieve long-lasting peace, because as long as we don't have justice, there will never be lasting peace in Palestine or in any other colonized nation. So we're going to move on to our final panelist now, Geo Maher. Geo is the coordinator of the W.E.B. Du Bois Movement School for Abolition and Reconstruction, and the author of books like Decolonizing Dialectics, Anticolonial Eruptions, A World Without Police, and many others. Geo, I think he's going to speak on decolonization. I'm super excited. Give it up, y'all.
Thank you all for being here. I'm really so excited to see the room is full. We've got a few events this week. They've all been full. And I think that says something about where we're at, where our movements are at, the fact that we're all absolutely fucking exhausted, but we're here, we're building, we're continuing to struggle. And incredibly glad to be here, joined by my comrades, Nicki and Hiram, and by you all. And to see this space for the first time, it's the first time I've seen it. It's a beautiful space, and I'm very excited. And to thank you all for the work that you have been doing, because I know you've been holding it down as well, here for Palestine, for Eddie Rizal, and many others. And I want to begin just by saying that, you know, in this space, todos somos palestinos, todos somos boricua, todos somos resistencia, todos somos revolución, y que estamos aquí juntos para profundizar esos lazos y esas relaciones. I coordinate a school called the Du Bois School for Abolition and Reconstruction. And part of what we say at the school is, right in the title, is that there's no abolition without reconstruction. We can't tear down coercive carceral institutions without building up a new kind of society that doesn't require those institutions. But the other thing that we teach at the school is that there can be no abolition without decolonization. That decolonization and abolition are intimately linked. That there can be no decolonization without also abolishing those carceral structures that uphold colonial rule every single day. And we know this despite the fact that there are many efforts to artificially divide these struggles, right? to say you got this one struggle that happens maybe outside the US for decolonization, and this struggle maybe happening inside the US against legacies specifically of slavery. But we know that the US is a colonizer internally, right? We know that it's built on not only slavery, but also genocide. We know that these twin devastations, these twin inhumanities are the foundation of the United States. And we know that Puerto Rico, of course, sits as living proof of the fact that the external is never internal, right? That there are colonies today that we are insisting are part of the US, even though the United States doesn't want to give and provide the rights that those, that internal membership in that country would provide. So we know this. We know that abolition and decolonization are linked because we know that slavery and colonialism were linked. We know this because they were born of the same long history and the same global capitalist system. We know that colonialism created capitalism as a global system by the seizure of the Western Hemisphere in 1492, as Hiram was talking about. That's when capitalism became global, through colonialism. We know that it brought slavery to the Western Hemisphere, deepened it, made it more important, made it central to that global capitalist system. We know that both of these structures, colonialism and slavery, were central to what we call primitive accumulation, what Marx called primitive accumulation, which not only expanded capitalism, instituted it as a global system, but sped up its development, made it incredibly rich through the dispossession of people, stealing land, stealing resources, and through the dispossession of labor and enslavement as well, right? Hyper-exploitation. Colonialism and slavery are modes of hyper-exploitation, of the theft of land, the theft of resources, and this has always been central to colonialism. If there's one thing we can say is that Marx did not give this enough weight, right? Did not recognize that this process of primitive accumulation, slavery, and colonialism is a permanent part of what the United States and global capitalism does. We know that decolonization and abolition are intimately linked because we know that the struggle against slavery was a global struggle. We know that the Haitian Revolution of 1804, probably the most important single event in human history, and yet we don't learn about it in history books. We know that this was a struggle not only against slavery, but also against French colonial rule. We know that it set off struggles across Latin America a decade later for independence, against enslavement. We know that it was 50 years before that struggle would land in the US, right? This was a global struggle against slavery and against the hyper-exploitation of slavery and colonialism abroad. We know that slavery and colonialism, abolition and decolonization are linked because we know the history of abolition in the United States. For people that haven't read W.E.B. Du Bois' Great Black Reconstruction, this is an essential text. I urge you to read it. It's a history of the Civil War. It's a history of the brief moment of freedom under Reconstruction that was destroyed by white terrorism. But it's also a story, and this is a crucial part that's not really understood often enough. It's a story of the dawning of US imperialism. Because for Du Bois, the defeat of Reconstruction opened up a whole different kind of world. The agreement, the conclusion of Reconstruction, the instantiation of legal white supremacy across the US South meant why not, of course, also project white supremacy on a global level. As Du Bois put it, the defeat of Reconstruction made the United States a reactionary force that set about to enslave and oppress and exploit what he called the great dark proletariat across the globe. This is a global structure. We know it because within 20 years, 20 short years of the defeat of Reconstruction, US imperialism seized the Philippines, seized Cuba, seized Puerto Rico, colonies and neo-colonies, and pieces of colonies in the case of Guantanamo that persist today. This was enabled by white supremacy, by the victory and defeat of white supremacy in the US South. We know that decolonization and abolition are linked because we know that oppressed populations within the United States, Black and brown alike, are internal colonies. We know this from the conditions that they share with external colonies. We know it from the conditions that they share within cities, right? Poverty rates, life expectancy, right? You can look at the most basic levels. We know these conditions are shared because we know who killed Eddie Irizarry. We know that abolition and decolonization are linked because we know that policing and imprisonment are global phenomena, global structures, global institutions, interlocking institutions that have always been imperial and colonial and continue to be today. Yes, the police in the United States were founded on the basis of slave catchers. They were also founded on the basis of colonial policing in Ireland, in Haiti, in South America. The founders of the Pennsylvania State Police had come back from occupying Haiti to found the Pennsylvania State Police, only to go break union strikes in Western Pennsylvania that were largely dominated by immigrant, non-English speaking communities of workers, right? This is all one circuit. And we see it perfectly clearly in the settler colony that is Israel. I don't even know why we debate whether this is a settler colony, because that's what its founding fathers proudly proclaimed it to be. And they did so with the same exact language that the original colonizers did when they say a land without people for a people without land. This is what they said in Australia. This is what they said in the US. And it's not even entirely a lie, because they built an entire system in which the people that were there didn't count as people. They were saying a truth, just as the Israelis and the settlers did. It was a state founded on dispossession and elimination, and this process of elimination continues, of course, today in hyperdrive. We should be very clear about the goal of elimination. It exists in two modes, of course. Gaza is one mode, right? The total closure, the imprisonment, open imprisonment of the population. And the West Bank is a very different mode. We can understand the way that they relate together, right? You've got the West Bank as this sort of totally infested space in which Israeli power just cuts across it and circulates through it, and it's policed. But we should not mistake the fact that that is not simply apartheid. And I think the phrase apartheid is important, but it's not strong enough, right? That is also colonized, right? Apartheid can be mistaken for calling for a new legal structure of equality. And on a certain level, that's what we're talking about. What we're really talking about is decolonization, what that actually means. And as many have emphasized, as many here in Philadelphia emphasize, when we talk about who makes the tear gas used in Palestine, who makes the tear gas used on I-676, who trains the police that are beating people, killing people here in the United States, we know the ways in which Israel has self-consciously placed itself at the center of a global incarceration and surveillance apparatus, which is a powerfully economic apparatus, the cutting edge of global capitalism. We know that abolition is relevant for Palestine, not only because of Israel, but also because of the fucking Palestinian police established by Oslo and engaging in security coordination with the state of Israel to disperse anti-colonial resistance, to prevent it from coming to a head, to play a middleman role in oppressing Palestinian people. And we know that abolition is crucial for understanding contemporary Palestine, because we know, as Nicki and many others have emphasized, that October 7th was a jailbreak. It was a quite literal jailbreak. So when we're talking about imprisonment, mass incarceration here, we need to be talking about global jails. We need to talk about the open air prison that is Gaza. And we need to talk about the inevitability that Nicki emphasized. The inevitability of decolonization, of abolition. This is what Frantz Fanon stated so clearly in The Wretched of the Earth, not only in speaking of the violence of decolonization, but about the fact that that violence of decolonization is the refraction of colonial violence. The colonial violence that is pumped every day into the colonized space, into the Gaza Strip. How much violence do you think you can pump into a single space before it explodes? The explosion is inevitable. and the explosion has a clear function. These are systems built on invisibility, on non-existence, on the deep desire for Palestinians simply to cease to exist, right? The mass denial of the Nakba, the mass denial that Palestine is even a thing. And October 7th made perfectly clear that Palestine is the thing, right? That veil of invisibility was exploded. They tell us over and over again, and they tell us about Minneapolis, right? They tell us that you shouldn't riot, you shouldn't light things on fire, you shouldn't engage in violent struggle because that's counterproductive. And then everything that they do shows us how productive it's been. Everything that's happened since October 7th shows us just how important the attacks were, just how important the Al-Aqsa flood has been. The fact that you can no longer deny what's happening. The fact that while it's brutal, that brutality is the brutality of colonialism reflected back upon itself. That is what happened. And there's no way around that. And we can sit with the ethical difficulty of that, but that means taking seriously the fact that you need to stop fucking colonizing people if you don't want them to fight back. History has been set into motion by that struggle. And we stand with that struggle. We stand with the flood. We stand with Palestinian liberation by any means. And we do so not just because we stand with any and all people fighting oppression. We stand with Palestine not only because their oppression is so similar to the oppression, the colonial oppression of Puerto Ricans, of Black Philadelphians, that so many others suffer here. We stand with Palestinians because they are freeing everyone, as Nicki pointed out. They are freeing us. They are freeing everyone from the river to the sea in the process of decolonizing Palestine. And decolonizing Palestine from the river to the sea means true equality. Of course, it means land back, but it also means a new form of governance in which the same people who occupied that land prior to 1948 in peace, in coexistence, are able to do so again. And they're freeing us because look at our movements. Look at what's been happening in the cycles of the past few months and the ways that struggles around Palestine have seen the interaction and the intersection and the engagement and the consolidation and collaboration of struggles that have been developing for many years. 2020, 2014, 2011. Cycles of struggle that are coming together because of this universal call that Palestinians have given us. They're helping us to get free every day. They're helping us to finish here the unfinished project of reconstruction. And they're helping us to free ourselves from the Combahee River to the Caribbean Sea. So when I give you a Viva Palestina, just give me a Viva right back, okay? Okay? Viva Palestina!
Viva!
Viva Puerto Rico libre!
Viva!
Viva Filiberto Ojeda!
Viva!
Viva Abu Obeda!
Viva! That was amazing, y'all. Thank you so much. I'm fired up. Yeah, I think that, thank you so much, Geo. I'm trying to just like process everything that you said. When it comes to like connecting the global, right, and this internationalist view to what's happening here locally, I'm so glad that you mentioned police repression specifically, because we don't have to look far to see how not just Puerto Ricans, but Philadelphians are directly linked to the violence that's happening in Palestine and Gaza and the West Bank. We know that the PPD here literally gets sent to Israel and trains with the IDF and exchanges worst practices, and then comes back here to our neighborhoods to militarize them, to criminalize our folks, to kill young Puerto Rican and Black people just like Eddie Irizarry. And then when we're out here protesting, demanding a free Palestine, those same PPD cops target our protests, shove journalists, push protesters on the ground. Just a couple weeks ago, we were at a peaceful protest in Center City and they ordered the towing of multiple Palestinian community members' cars, completely unwarranted. And so it's this type of police repression that is directly linked, right? We looked up the cop that ordered that towing and he has like a documented history of Islamophobia. And so these systems are connected. Ultimately, both of these struggles are anti-imperialist struggles. And I hope that y'all feel directly connected to that as people who live here in Philadelphia and in the belly of the beast. I want to open it up to the audience to be able to ask your questions. I have a question though for the panelists first to start it off, and that's just like, what is at stake here, right? Like, what would it mean for imperialism if Palestine were freed, if Puerto Rico were freed? What would it mean for working class people all over the globe? Why is the US ruling class so invested in maintaining these settler colonies? And why is this struggle so important?
Palestine is the place where everything comes together, and it's not a coincidence that when people start talking about Palestine, they start talking about Sudan and Congo, and they start talking about their own condition, and it reveals how the US has been repressing us, how people think that they have freedom the moment they speak out about Palestine, they lose their jobs, their dogs, they're harassed, incarcerated, what have you. And I think the reason that they don't want us to speak about Palestine is because once Palestine is free, we're going to see a huge avalanche of freedom struggles. Because Palestine did it, why can't we? And on top of that, you know, I think people are having, and we've talked about this before, are having like an existential crisis about what it means to live in this world right now. I think people aren't understanding the logic of anything that's happening in Palestine. We're seeing things with our eyes and ears, and we're then being told that it's not real, or you don't know the full story. And the simple truth is that there is nothing that could have happened on October 7th that justifies the killing of 20,000 people, of over, like, unfortunately, I've lost the number, 8,000 children, if not more. The fact that we don't even know how many are trapped under rubble. And yeah, I think it's just horrifying in general.
Like I mentioned before, a free Puerto Rico means the collapse of US military control of maritime industry in the Caribbean, but also military interventions in Central and Latin America. Since the 40s, the United States has used Puerto Rico as a military outpost, like I mentioned, to develop weapons, specifically like Agent Orange, that was then dropped in Vietnam, the bombs that are used to bomb Palestine, right? Military interventions have gone all the way as far as Yugoslavia, when Yugoslavia was in Bosnia and Herzegovina afterwards, right? So a free Puerto Rico means that the United States can no longer hold Puerto Rico as a military base, which is all it is to the United States, right? It's a military base. Its location for its capitalist extraction by way of its big box stores. So Puerto Rico has the highest concentration of Walgreenses per capita per mile than anywhere else in the world. There are more Walmarts, there are more Targets, Burger Kings on Puerto Rican soil because of tax incentives that capitalism and these big corporations do. All that collapses with the free Puerto Rico. It means that the containment of Cuba and Cuba's model, right, the inspiration that Cuba is, will be allowed to flourish and spread as it has always had through the Caribbean if the U.S. Navy, U.S. Marines, the U.S. Army are not there in Puerto Rico. It means that Plan Colombia in Colombia doesn't have that backing, right, to try to control South America with its military interventions in that way. And so a free Puerto Rico means freedom for many of the islands in the Caribbean, but also with the rest of Latin America. Not to mention what that means for the over 4 million Puerto Ricans who live in this country, who, like Palestinians, come from a people who have always dreamt and always dreamed of returning back home, who come from parents and grandparents who always dreamed of returning back home, who were forced out of our country, as Geo mentioned, through this Act 60 that's come by way of a fiscal control board that was placed there in 2016 by Barack Hussein Obama, that puts Wall Street in control of the entire government and economy of Puerto Rico, that has led to the largest wave of austerity that the country has ever seen. Mass school closures, the closing of hospitals, the closing of every public sector that you can imagine, the privatization of an electrical grid that doesn't work and has created an intense contradiction of capitalism on the island and within the diaspora. Those of us who have families still over there suffering, right? Then that means that free Puerto Rico inspires us It motivates us. It agitates us to continue to struggle for more like we always have. We have always been not only Puerto Rican revolutionaries who have fought for a free Puerto Rico, but there have been Puerto Rican Black Liberation Army members. There have been Puerto Ricans who have fought with the Republic of New Africa. There are Puerto Ricans who have fought for bilingual education all the way out in Chicano studies, all the way out in California. And the Arthur Schomburg Center for Black History in Harlem, New York, there have been Puerto Ricans who have been committed to the history and the struggle of New African people here in this country. And so a free Puerto Rico continues that legacy, continues that tradition of solidarity, of that compromise that Puerto Rican people have always had with the oppressed people of the world, right? And will continue that wave and that storm that Don Pedro had talked about. And I'll wrap it up because what we moved from and what we understood and learning from our forefathers, specifically Don Pedro the homeland is valor and sacrifice. And we've always internalized and we've always understood, just like the Palestinian people, that our lives are meant valor and sacrifice. And we do not exist just to be good on our own, right? Our duty, our responsibility is to make sure that we are all free, is that we are all good. And so a free Puerto Rico will continue in that legacy, continue in that tradition, and set off a wave that this country has received.
Yeah, no, I think both Hiram and Nicki have shown and have explained how free Palestine means free everybody. Free Puerto Rico means free everybody. And I think one of the questions we should ask is why that is, why that's the case, right? The US government had this theory, this paranoid theory of the threat of a communist beachhead in the Western Hemisphere. And they spared no level of atrocity, justifying fascism, justifying the killing of tens of thousands of people to prevent the establishment of a communist beachhead in the Western Hemisphere. Why? Because they knew that the example will be contagious. They knew that people were already fighting for freedom, and if they had, an example of the success of that struggle, then there was really no stopping it, right? This is why Cuba is so important, right? This is why Cuba is a thorn in the side of U.S. empire that is so painful, right? And Frantz Fanon has this great quote about Dien Bien Phu. If people remember, Dien Bien Phu, 1954, is the moment when Vietnamese defeated French forces. And it provided an example that helped to set off the early wave of mid-century decolonization. And it wasn't just that people didn't know that they could fight prior to that, it's that they didn't know they could win, right? This is a very concrete point, right? Because they're fighting an advanced army with tanks and missiles and weapons, and they have very little of that of their own. Dien Bien Phu was an inversion of forces that showed that guerrilla struggle could defeat the most advanced armies on earth. And so after 1954, as Fanon put it, the colonized task everywhere is to create another Dien Bien Phu, right? Because they knew it was possible, because they had an example, because they knew a new technique, guerrilla warfare, was able to transform the balance of forces in a way that could be successful. And it was, and this is what sets off this wave. And they know that, right? They know that the example of the absolute impossibility becoming possible, which is what happened on October 7th, is such a big symbolic threat to them, right? This is why they can't tolerate small examples. This is why when we think to ourselves, why is this so important to them? It's because it's a house of cards, right? It will all collapse once people realize their power and realize that they can resist in the same ways.
Thank you so much, Al. Yeah, U.S. empire is a paper tiger, and we've seen it fall before. I want to open it up to the audience for questions. Does anybody?
I have a question.
Yes.
Now, Mike, I understand. My question is related to Congress and the Biden administration. And currently they passed a resolution equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And it's the Congress that we have an issue with, because they are so controlled by AIPAC. And how do we move forward? I mean, we can protest all we like, and put the bodies in front of the White House and do the demonstration. But I mean, they're getting paid millions. Those congressmen that represent us, our constituents, they're paid millions. I mean, 25. I mean, they're selling their soul. I don't know how, it distressed me because I know what's going on over there. And I live abroad majority of my life. I lived in Tunisia for 30 years. My husband's Tunisia. I currently live in Qatar. And I know I've been around, I'm a Muslim, converted Muslim in a sense myself, and I know Islam, and I know the Christians, and I know the lovely people and my relatives. And it hurts me to see that. So I'm just wondering, what can we do? I mean, because sometimes I feel like it's hopeless. I mean, I understand when Norman Finkelstein felt like it was hopeless after so many years. Because you try and you push and you talk to your own congressmen. I mean, Featherman, I didn't vote for him at all. You know, I ended up voting him independently when I was here, because I tend to come every October. But I'm just, do you see the kind of people that we're putting in office? And how do we go? How do we move? What do we do?
I think part of what you're identifying is the reason that so many are having an existential crisis. I think at some point, maybe a lot of people in this room have moved away from the sort of electoral politics that we know of. And I think the thing to do is organize ourselves beyond protest. I think that because Palestine is where so many things come together, you can organize on every front. If you are in the restaurant industry, a chef, food critic, what have you, there is a whole campaign going on against Solomonov's restaurants. There are ways to organize against the appropriation of food and talk about Israeli occupation. If you are a cultural worker, a writer, an artist, you can boycott Israel. You can demand ceasefires. You can apply pressure in specific ways. I think depending on what field you're in, it's about organizing yourself, and then to sustain that organization. I mean, we are in the second month now. Was it, let's say the 9th? 2 days ago was 2 months since October 7th, and people are still going hard. I mean, I have not seen this. I saw pictures from London today, and it looks like their numbers haven't dwindled at all. And what rapper and commentator Loki said is like, if this isn't the time, if this isn't the time for a general strike, then I don't know what is. And I think we're moving towards more sustained action. They shut down Elbit systems. They aren't letting Zim ships enter ports. I think in the Bay, they actually got on the ship. But with that comes more repression. So we have to organize ourselves in more strategic ways, in ways that keep us safe. But that's just one answer.
I mean, when we came into this building, we walked past posters of the great Louis Lebron, who had a very specific approach to Congress, right? And just to say, like, and I don't think this is tongue in cheek, and it's not, it's to agree with what Nicki is saying, right? We've come through a moment where people were very geared toward electoral questions, right? I mean, and again, it's always this like back and forth, but now we're in a very important sort of breaking point where people, I think, what was the sort of tweet before something else, like call your representative and tell them to go fuck themselves, right? Because the system, right, whether it's whether it's Congress, whether it's the media, whether it's the universities, which we see a lot in in Philadelphia, are holding an absolutely impossible line, right? The congressional, resolution. The same shit that's going on with the federal investigation of universities, which is trying to say that intifada is hate speech, that from the river to the sea is hate speech, right? That is an impossible line to hold, and it's got nothing to do with our struggles at this point. And so people are very rightly withdrawing from that. I don't know how Biden gets through this, right? I don't know what's going to happen over the next year, whether he's just going to disappear and someone else is going to try to pick up a failing campaign because he can't win without the votes of the people that he's not only alienating, but having killed right now, right? This is part of the problem, but the answer is always to organize ourselves. And again, amid the difficulty and the pain and the suffering, I too am so optimistic at what we're seeing in the streets, right? 10,000 people in a Palestinian-led march down the parkway, stopping for prayer on the way to the Rocky Steps is 100% unprecedented.
Yeah.
And the fact that no media outlet reported on it doesn't change the fact that it happened, right? Doesn't change the fact that it hasn't ceased happening, right? This is what gives me optimism.
The one thing I'll say is that the Puerto Rican struggle has shown us that those elected officials don't represent us. Those aren't our Congress people, they're not there to represent us. Joe Biden has said before, right, if Israel didn't exist, they would create one. So the idea that AIPAC money does influence politicians, but that is not the reason why that military base over there exists, right? Because that's all it is a military base to control the oil and to control that region, to continue to extract for profits for the capitalists over here in this country. And so there is nothing that the United States government, its politicians, its institutions can never do for us that would give us, right? And we've learned that and we've understood that as a colony, right? Through the boycotts of elections in Puerto Rico, but also calling for Puerto Rico to boycott elections here because it's just a colonial puppet show. Well, one of our leaders, Juan Antonio Correja, who was the founder of the Puerto Rican Marxist movement, right, and the godfather of Puerto Rican armed resistance movement, underground movement, had mentioned as well that this is a struggle between revolution and reform. And that what chains us and continues to chain us as Puerto Ricans, and I would say to the rest of us colonized people here in the United States, right, to colonialism is the reformism that lives in our heads. Right.
Okay, so
And
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. When you're saying reform, to me, it seems more likely like we cannot manage to go through our normal systems. Because when we're going through a normal system of complaints and talking to our congressmen and sending letters and protesting, that seems to be going on deaf ears. So what you're saying is probably almost reform is very kind word to say, but maybe like an uprising. Because it's getting to the point where our Congress is not listening to us.
Because they're not there to listen to you, right? They're not there. They're there to facilitate capital. They're there to suppress us. They're there to make sure that we stay in line and continue with the order of the system, right? Under this bourgeois dictatorship, right? And bourgeois rule in this country. And so the only way that we get free is with the toppling of this system. And the only way the system gets toppled is through organization. Right, and not just organization of folks just organize themselves into little affinity groups or whatever. I mean, we do a lot of that already, right? And a lot of times, all it leads us is to marching in circles every week, every day for every other issue. It doesn't ever really get to what we're trying to get to. And what we need is development of political organization. And what Don Pedro was talking about, right? Organizations with strategy and political discipline that also have the mechanisms and the capacity to build the forces from the people themselves in order to wage that fight. Because like Malcolm X have reminded us, right, that revolution is bloody, revolution is violent, and the only way out of this Babylon, right, is through that violence. And Geo, who's the expert in this, right, can lean on and talk more about Fanon's approach, right, that violence will only yield to greater violence, right? But before you even get to that point, right, is you need to organize the folks. You need to talk to the people. You need to crush that reformism in their brain, which is what Don Juan Correja was talking about, right? Because reforms are basically, they're just the victories, revolutionary victories that have been watered down in order to maintain the rule, right, of the dominant class and of the system itself. So every reform that we have gotten, and be they voting rights, and be they housing rights, and be they this or that or whatever, those are victories that were won through action, right, on the ground of the people, and then have been taken away from the people and watered down. And then we see that as a victory and feel like, oh yeah, if I just keep writing to my congressman, if I just keep electing folks, if I just keep voting harder and keep voting harder and keep voting harder, something is going to happen. And yet it doesn't happen. And so what the Palestinian struggle has shown us, what the Puerto Rican struggle has shown us, what the New African struggle, what the struggles around the world have shown us, right, is that the only thing that wins is disciplined organization, strong political ideology, right, and that valor and sacrifice from the people and from those movements to topple those systems, right, in order to free ourselves and give that independence, take back our land, allow our people to come home, right, in this country with the land back in Puerto Rico and in Palestine, in order to build that future that we want to see that is inclusive and is better for the rest of the world.
Thank you. Thank you for an amazing question. I want to take like 2 or 3 questions and then I'll head back to the pen.
Hello. I just wanted to know if you could elaborate a little bit more on the relationship of Puerto Rico and Palestine, and like Puerto Rico specifically, like Aguadilla, West Side being used to manufacture weapons, and that is like more of a rural area, which is kind of like very, very displaced. It's not like as someone, but you know, we see a lot of like crypto colonizers, all of these people moving into Aguadilla, Mayagüez, Rincon, and sort of kind of like becoming a hub for producing and part of these weapons or fully, and then also being a place where jobs are kind of like escasos, and just like the local people kind of participating as well. Escasos is like it's not.
Here,
Yeah,
here.
yeah. Sorry, I don't know if that's clear, makes sense. Thank you. Okay. All other hands.
Hey, thank you so much for coming here, sharing your knowledge. I'd love to piggyback on her question about like what to do next. And if y'all could talk about the importance of mutual aid efforts and sustainability in like post-resistance organizing, because if we do topple the empire, we'll have to have something in place, right? In order to continue to meet the needs of our communities and keep society going. And Puerto Rico, we saw that need more than ever, you know, after Hurricane Maria, because the government, you know, deliberately did not provide aid to the people. The way that they're stopping humanitarian aid in Gaza is the same thing that they did to Puerto Rico, right? And not just that, but after Fiona and after the earthquakes, right? There was like the diaspora here played a major role in providing goods, services, expertise, like nurses and doctors from here went over there. El pueblo salva el pueblo. Sí, el pueblo salva el pueblo, exacto. So, you know, in terms of solutions, you know, mutual aid is a really big part of that. And so if you could talk about mutual aid in Palestine and Puerto Rico and how that mutual aid is resistance as well.
One more question, or you want to take those two?
One more, I think.
One more?
Good afternoon.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Score with Black Alliance for Peace. I want to thank the Congress of CSL for this very important discussion that I've wondered for several years about Palestine and Puerto Rico. Last month, we spoke at the demonstration in DC, November 4th, and we deliberately chose our words by calling out all the Negro Zionists. I mean, Black folks who are aiding and abetting Zionism, and we know they know better. Like Reverend Al Sharpton, like Reverend William Barber, like Congressman Torres in New York, etc. My question is, how do we hold these folks accountable? What does that mean politically? And how do we, you know, whatever kind of way, increase the level of political education that we are not afraid to call out some of our homies? Me, I'm ready to call out Mayor-elect Terrell Parker for that sign, I stand with Israel. She don't even know where it is. So we need that. We need something like that for our political education. Thank you all.
The first question around the role of Puerto Rico, like weapons development and all that. Again, it goes back to Puerto Rico's primary role as a military outpost for U.S. domination in the region and U.S. control in the region. And so post 1970, right, and the rise of neoliberalism when the United States stops producing things, the only thing it produces is weapons and becomes the largest weapons manufacturer and weapons dealer in the entire world, right? That ends up showing up in Puerto Rico as well. It's like I said, with the annexation and the use of, so Puerto Rico is an archipelago, right? Puerto Rico is made up of a number of islands. You only know like the one Puerto Rico that some of you may have visited, right? But there's a number of islands that make up Puerto Rico. One of those islands, I guess, was used since the 1940s as a bombing range and a bombing test site right? Not just for the US military, but was also rented out to militaries in Italy and militaries around the world to come bomb the island. All the way up until a local movement in 1999 was able to stop that finally, right? And end that practice. But those bombs are tested on military weapon tanks that still reside on those little islands, right? The Agent Orange, the chemical bombs, all the things are tested on that island in Puerto Rico and then used over there across the globe, where we see it, right? That practice of testing not only weapons, but also testing drugs continues in Puerto Rico today because it's a colony. And therefore, it falls under the below the jurisdiction of like the United States and Congress. Well, you can't do it to US citizens, but those people over there, whatever. So even not just bombs, but your modern birth control pills are tested in Puerto Rico, right? Through the devastating sterilization product, but also the incredible amount of horrific science projects and experiments that happen on Puerto Rican women's bodies, right? To develop those birth control pills that realistically are wreaking havoc on women's bodies today, right? That is the role that Puerto Rico plays for the United States and continues. So when you talk about the lack of jobs, again, it's that crisis of capitalism, right? The contradictions that come with capitalism, where on one end, capitalist industrialization was supposed to take this little island nation, right, and move from this agricultural economy to industrialized and become the model for the Caribbean. That model also with racial undertones, because Puerto Rico is also the whitest of all the islands of the Caribbean, which happened on purpose.
Yeah.
With the influx, right, giving lands to white Europeans to come in post the Haitian Revolution to make sure these niggas don't ever do that again. Right? And Puerto Rico continues to play that role militarily, racially, economically. But the contradiction is that those benefits don't come back to the Puerto Rican people themselves, who the majority still live under some form of economic assistance, especially after NAFTA took all those factories and moved them out and created a greater dependency on the US dollar and US economy and debt, which enslaves Puerto Rico today through the Promesa Act, right?
Yeah.
That has the majority of folks continue to lose their jobs purposely to push people out of the island. So now post-Maria, you're talking about almost over 700,000 people who have left Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico went from having 4 million people on the island down to about 2.5 million people. And Act 60 that says white people from the United States, millionaires, can come live in Puerto Rico, not have to pay income tax, not to pay any taxes, because they see it as opportunity zones, where the 99% of the island is labeled by the US government as an opportunity zone for development. And what you have seen is an influx of settlers, is what they are, settlers who have come into Puerto Rico, who have bought up everything. So if your home is not owned by a white person from the United States, it's owned by Airbnb. Right? To displace Puerto Ricans, an island surrounded by water, where almost majority of the beaches are becoming privatized. And when they say that local residents of Puerto Rico can't go to the beach on an island because it belongs and is owned by some motherfucker who lives in Oklahoma somewhere.
Watch out now. Dolphins can't fish in their own water.
Yeah.
Right, and the similarities are there. And so the goal is to push Puerto Ricans off the island, not provide jobs, and even if they want to, they can't. Because the economic system, right, that was in place and imposed on Puerto Rico can't sustain it.
Plus, all of the people that leave are younger, so you have the generation gap.
You have the brain
elders
drain.
And like really like little
Right.
children.
Right, the closing of hospitals led to doctors leaving, the closing of schools led to teachers leaving, right? The amount of brain drain, college students who are graduating, have no future left in Puerto Rico, have to up and leave. And there's so many of them that they don't come to the traditional zones of Puerto Rican community. Philadelphia, New Jersey, Connecticut, New York. They're going to Florida. They're going to Texas. They're going to Arizona. Because even in these places where Puerto Ricans reside, because we had never we're never free of US colonialism. We're being displaced from here too. We can't get jobs here too. We're being gentrified out here. We're being killed and arrested here too, and continue that attack, not just on Puerto Ricans, but on Black people as well, who now end with this, who've always had an intimate relationship. Is the beautiful thing about being Puerto Rican is that we have an intimate relationship with everybody in the world. Historically, politically, right? It is that migration of the 1950s, the so-called migration of the 1950s that pushed Puerto Ricans out of Puerto Rico, Operation Bootstrap, and Black people from the South, making them realistically economic and political refugees is what they were. It is so to us of the Great Migration that they were refugees. And we met together in New York. We met together in Philadelphia. We met together in New Jersey, right? To combine those two struggles and those two experiences, because we can't win alone. And that has been the beauty of the Puerto Rican struggle. It's to very easily intertwine itself with everybody else's struggle. I can see myself and you, Don Rafael Cancel Miranda, who was there with Lolita Lebron in the attack on Congress in 1954, as a member of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party. I'm sorry for taking up so much time, right? But when we talk about Lolita Lebron, and it goes back to the question of how we fight back, Lolita Lebron wasn't just a girl boss. She wasn't just a woman who did this on her own. Lolita Lebron was a commando member of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, organized under the leadership of the president with a strategy and a tactic, understood what needed to be done when the moment had to be done. And she never renounced that, came back and became the leader of that said party. And that gets taken out of her message, because what we live in now today, going to answer some of these other questions, I'm gonna give that, I swear to God, is the importance of organization. And so we've seen in the lessons that we've learned in Puerto Rico as well, right, as we learned here, post-Maria is a non-profitization of our struggle. So as Maria and austerity has wreaked havoc in Puerto Rico and is displacing us and is pushing us out, what you end up having is foundations like the Rockefeller Fund did, like the Ford Foundation did here to the Black struggle here in the United States, right, is giving out grants to create projects and nonprofit organizations that seek to address these issues through reform, not through revolution. Because when the state fell in Puerto Rico during Maria and there was nothing there was no government, there was nothing, it's what you were referring to. It was the people themselves who had to stand up and figure out how to take care of themselves amidst of no power, no food, no water. I mean, devastation that doesn't rival Gaza, right? But for us was damn near Gaza, because we couldn't call our families. We didn't know if they were alive. We didn't know if we would ever see them again, right? Because everything fell. What they didn't want was for the people to wake up and fight back and take back what is ours. In the United States government couldn't even make it in there to do anything about that. But what they did do was send grants. And they sent a lot of grants. That's great. And what you have here with the non-profitization of movement that also comes with the academics, no shade to the academics in the room, right? But the ivory tower jumping in, giving us frameworks and its languages and its ideas and everything else other than organizing, then it confuses a lot of people. So we have post-Ferguson in this country is the heavy non-profitization of Black struggle in this country, but also this weird framework of this leaderless movement stuff and extreme horizontalism that is right, that is ruled by identity reductionism, right, that talks about only through your affinity group and just doing a whole bunch of direct actions randomly. Something will happen. Yeah. Magic will happen. What you don't need is organization. What you don't need is strong political ideology, because that's authoritarian bullshit. Right? Because that's never won, except it won in Cuba in 1959. It won in Cape Verde. It won in China. It won in Vietnam. Right? It won in Angola. Right? And so what we need today, and it's not to shade, right, the work that is happening, because all resistance is important, but we have to understand the limitations of that. And so we talk and we rely solely on mutual aid, which, let's be very clear, mutual aid today is not the mutual aid that Kropotkin was talking about. This is where this comes from. For those who read anarchist history and the anarchist canon, most anarchists don't even read anarchist canon, right? Mutual aid today is not really aid, right? Because it's not alleviating folks. It's in that very moment, your sandwich that you gave that person fed them for that hour. Doesn't feed them for the whole day, right? Your $50 you sent on Cash App, cool. But that person's rent is still up the next month. It's not real aid, nor is it mutual, because there is no mutuality, there's no mutual giving back and forth. It's you and your squad showing up with sandwiches, showing up with cash, showing up with whatever to feed. Is it important? Absolutely, it's important. But does it have its limitations? It absolutely does. And we have to be very real about that. And so I, for one, am not someone who says we can mutual aid our way to liberation. The only way that happens is through organization, is through political discipline, is through theoretical and ideological discipline, right? It's getting in the streets with the people. It's relationship building. It's being the folks where they're at. It's the revolutionary patience, right? That Claudia de la Cruz always talks about, right? Is that our folks are not going to have the perfect language all the time. And they're not going to say the best things all the time, but we have to have that patience with them to meet them where they're at, address their needs, put in context, the political context, help them see who is responsible for the oppression and the repression that they're facing, organize them, and together from the people, we will find that path to liberation, right? It's not going to be an elite group of revolutionaries who does that on their own and leads that, but you have to get out with the people. We've lost in this organizing is the ability to talk to everyday people and desire to talk to everyday people, because we read so many books, and books are wonderful.
Yeah.
Geo writes amazing books. And I'm not saying that because he's here. I literally mean it, and Geo knows this. Geo writes incredible books, right? That are written from his experiences with everyday people. With everyday people. Geo's work, even through abolition school, is with everyday people. And that is what informs his books that then can give us the theory and the knowledge that we need to move forward. And so for me to answer this question, it's only through political organization. It is only through organizing with people, relationship building, that we can truly find the answers on how to get rid of this and ultimately topple this system. Because the only way out is to burn this Babylon down and build something on top of its ashes.
Do your best, man. All I'm gonna say is ditto. There's no answer. Yeah, I mean, I think I already said it all. In terms of mutual aid, I have a hard time conceptualizing the question because there might be a mutual, but there's no aid. I mean, the pictures of grocery stores are empty. Nothing's coming in. People ask where they can donate to Gaza, and I say it's not going to come in. If they're even before October 9th, when they put in the blockade, were blocking the importation of chocolate and random other things, I highly doubt that our money is going to get there. So that's why the pressure has to be on ending the occupation period. As for your question, Asantwa, I also have a hard time conceptualizing it because I don't know what accountability looks like in this moment. I think what you're speaking to, though, is a rejection of some kind of identity politics that a lot of people have been employing and has been basically the defense of Israel for the last 75 years. And so I think we just need to talk about principles over identity, right? That it doesn't come with a specific set of politics, but that it is, people want to center their lived experiences as if all of our lived experiences are the same, regardless of where we're from. I think about 2020, for example, when the sort of revolutionary demand for abolishing the police was replaced with the defanged demand to vote in Kamala Harris as the first Black woman. Right, regardless of her role as a prosecutor, that didn't matter anymore. Like, this was where like Black liberation could take us to represent in the highest halls of Congress. So yeah, I don't know, accountability, I believe in shaming our officials. I believe in not letting them rest. That video of Trudeau being chased around by a bunch of folks, like I'm here for it. And that's what you want to do. But again, the demand has to be, like what Hiram says, organizing ourselves in ways that don't need elected officials to tell us that we need to support a genocide, period. So yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that.
I have a question also about.
Yeah,
Oh, I'm
just for
sorry.
the sake of time, we got to keep it rolling. Sorry.
I think Comrade Asantwa mentioned Al Sharpton. I think Hiram mentioned Vieques. And if I recall, Al Sharpton got arrested at Vieques, engaging in a direct action protest. So when we talk about people that don't know, maybe a Cheryl Parker, I'm not sure. I said we can talk about people that don't know any better, but Al Sharpton, as Asante was emphasizing, knows exactly what he's doing, right? These are opportunists at heart. These are not people that need to be educated or can be educated. These are people that are responding to huge checks, right? Huge checks in the hundreds of thousands in just the last election cycle from APAC to support these policies, right? That was what I was going to talk about. I was going to talk about mutual aid. And about the ways in which mutual aid, I think, should be understood is everything that helps sustain our struggles.
Yes, like
right?
growing food, right? Like.
Yeah, but even on a more micro level and from the micro to the macro level, right? And on the micro level, I always think about the fact that the Ferguson Rebellion lasted 2 weeks. Rebellion, mass rebellion in the streets lasted 2 weeks.
That's right.
And it lasted 2 weeks in part because people who had never been a part of Food Not Bombs or never been members of an organization showed up every day with tables of food and water and were sustaining the struggle in its sort of longevity, right? And that's just one micro example, right? Because when we get to the more macro level, we're talking about all the things that help us to, in a certain kind of way, smooth the historical terrain between upsurge and downswing, right? And it seemed like for a couple of years we were in a downswing, but look where we are now. And why? Because when the post 2020 downswing begins, people are organizing themselves. People are engaging in mutual aid and building mutual aid networks. People are studying, right? This is a large part of what we do at the Bois School, is to try to educate people for the next upsurge, right? To understand their role and their position. And when you engage in all of these processes, part of what you're doing is making the next upsurge inevitable, right? Part of what you're doing is that when some shit pops off in Gaza, people will be ready to respond. People won't go in for the electoral lines. They won't go in for the reformist lines. They'll realize, as we've been realizing, the narrative makes it really clear, right? For the first time, people en masse are talking about decolonizing Palestine, right? Not just dismantling apartheid, not just dealing with some of the excesses of a settler colonial regime, but questioning the very legitimacy of that regime as a whole, right? This is a very new thing, right? And that's because of the work that people have been putting in. That's because of the work that was put in between 2014 and 2020 in the movement for Black Lives, right? People in there pushing and saying, no, colonialism is a part of this question and Palestine is a part of this question. It took work for people to make sure that Palestine was a part of that, right? Which is why movement for Black Lives leaders are being demonized now as being anti-Semitic, right? Because people have been building this solidarity since 2014 and before, since 1967, as Robin Kelly emphasizes, right? When the 1967 war set off a huge wave of solidarity between Black revolutionaries and Palestinians, right? And so the point is to organize, to engage in that process of building, of education, of filling in the space between the upsurge and the downswing so that next time it comes, we'll be ready.
It is 2:45, we're gonna wrap up by 3, so I wanna close us out with one more question. Let's make it a good one, though. No pressure.
I think I had one.
I wanna get someone who hasn't asked, like, but feel free to, talk to afterwards.
Yeah, I got requests. I just want to ask that, you basically got two parties in the same damn party. One's a party of the Rainbow Coalition and the other's a party of white people. Start for what it is. Why is it that doesn't matter who you put in office? All these people, they all break down. They just break down. But the one guy we want to break down, he can't fucking break down. That's not the problem. So I just want to ask you, what do you think of that shit?
But when you say breakdown, what do you mean breakdown?
Break down, we start out like, yeah, we were rooting for Palestine. Then you get in their face and you go, oh, you ready for Palestine? Well, no, I think Jews have a right to, and all of a sudden, they break down. That's what I think, break down. But Donald Trump don't break down.
Sell out.
Like
Yeah,
Bernie,
sell out, yeah, sell
like
out.
Bernie Sanders was
Yeah,
very
like Bernie Sanders.
pro-Palestinian,
Exactly,
you know?
Thank you, Bernie Sanders. Yeah.
That's because they weren't elected by the time they told us that. You know, I look at the squad and how everyone was really hopeful about it, and they've been shit. Yeah, I mean, I don't. They sell out because there's pressure for them, because taking a principled stance on Palestine is not what they were elected to do. They were elected to, as Hiram said, keep the status quo, for the flow of capital, and to maintain that. And when the top down is we unequivocally stand with Israel, we'll create another Israel if this one doesn't exist. They still need popular support. That's why they're going to say, you know, oh, we need like a woman in office, or we need people of color in office, so that the bombs that drop are, you know,
Rainbow.
right. But nobody's advocating for no war, and if they do, they get censured like Rashida Tlaib or. So yeah, I think that's really it. These institutions don't serve us. We need to build our own.
Is there any way like we can sanction the mainstream media because they're constantly not reporting the news or how you say, promoting misinformation in the process as far as like Palestine, what's going on over there? Like one-sided story most of the time.
We live in a bourgeois dictatorship, right? Like the ruling class owns everything, from its politicians to its media to, there isn't any sanctions that we can impose, right? These politicians aren't elected to represent us, right? The first responsibility, the first thing on day 2, right? A politician gets elected. On day 2, their number one priority is what? Re-election is to get re-elected, right? Politics is a transactional game, right? If you want to move legislation, then you're gonna have to side with me on this other piece of legislation over here, right? It's a game of power. And so once these individuals, even if let's give them the benefit of the doubt, they go, I'm gonna change the system from the inside or whatever, right? Once you get inside that machine that has been created, has exists for over 200 years to maintain the class rule of this ruling class, then they find out very quickly, right? It plays by a different set of rules, right? And its transaction is a game of power. What we need to do on this end is not hope that this one individual is able to somehow topple or change an institution that has existed for class rule for over 200 years. It's how do we build our own institutions and our own organizations that can grow the power necessary to topple that. That's never going to be our game. That's never going to be our place with not their media, not their governments, not their schools, not any of that is ever going to work in our interests, right? And so it's a question of power. And so when I talk about, or you know, I talk dismissively, unintentionally, sort of kind of, right? Mutual aid or affinity groups or that approach to it, right? Is because it's not to say that it doesn't help, it doesn't work, it doesn't provide a certain, it absolutely does. All forms of resistance are extremely important. What they do is they're very limited in their ability to generate and create the amount and the type of power necessary to topple these institutions, or ultimately to topple that class rule. Because we are involved in a class war, whether we want to or not. Heavily racialized, heavily gendered, right? But a class war nonetheless. And so we have to build the institutions and the power organizations, right, that represent our class interests and understand that we are in a war. You're not going to, you know, walk into a room and like a Disney movie, shame this bad person, and then the cartoon birds start flying and everything magically happens. We're gonna have to fight to the death. And the only side that's dying is us. And the sooner we realize that, the sooner we can get to work, right? Because like Comrade George Jackson said, that electoralism is done, has been proven. He wrote this in 1971, has been proven to not be the vehicle. You're wasting your time looking for something there, right? He said fascism is already here.
It's already, yeah.
And he said if fascism could be summed up in one word, what word is that, Geo? Reform. Almost got it wrong. I got nervous. Let's reform. And so the only thing that these politicians can do, let's say they don't break down. The only thing they can at best do is some sort of reform that'll eventually get rolled back by the next administration. And that's the game that they play. And they come at us every 4 years. This is the most important election of your life. This is the most important election of your life. And everybody's like, right? It's I'm just making jokes.
Okay, thank you so much. Seriously, y'all. This was a great event, and I'm so thankful to our brilliant panelists and also for a brilliant audience who asked really important questions. A couple points. One, I know there were a lot of questions about elected officials, holding them accountable, electoral politics. You could look at Hiram's hoodie or my tote bag that's around here somewhere. You know, the Liberation Center is run by or staffed by members of the PSL, Party for Socialism and Liberation. We're running 2 candidates for president and vice president this year, Claudia de la Cruz and Karina Garcia. They're the only candidates who are working class mothers who have been out here since day one after October 7th, demanding free Palestine at the front of these protests in the streets with the people. And so I really encourage y'all to check them out, check out their platform. We don't run this campaign because we think we're gonna somehow win and just like win our liberation through an election cycle, but it's a way to promote our politics, right, and our ideology. So go check them out for sure.
Vote Socialist.
Yes, vote socialist 2024, right, .com. The other thing I want to say is, you know, I know it's been 2 hours. This room is really warm. I want people to go downstairs and get food. I know the chairs are not the most comfortable. If it's your first time here in the LC, a cool thing about this space is that it's completely grassroots. We don't take grants from, you know, nonprofits or the government or anything like that. We are run solely through community donations and our own members' dues. And so we're going to hand out some little boxes if you guys feel moved to make a donation for the lunch that we provided today, or to continue programming like this. We would appreciate it, as little or as big as you can. And then the last thing I want to say is just that I hope to see all of your faces again out at protests in the next coming days and weeks. We will continue to shut it down for Palestine. Just yesterday, we shut down the Comcast headquarters, and we're going to keep, you know, forums, direct actions, protests, whatever it takes until Palestine is free and until Puerto Rico is free, until all of us are free. So let's end it with a chant. From the belly of the beast,
From the belly of the beast,
we want justice, we want peace.
we want justice, we want peace.
From the belly of the beast,
From the belly of the beast,
we want justice, we want peace.
we want justice, we want peace.
Free Palestine. Thank you all so much.